So, can a scientist believe in miracles? I have given many Veritas forums over the years, and I always find that the most interesting part of these forums is the audience questions. And so I decided I would gather together all the questions that I've been asked over many years in these forums, and that became the basis of this book. The question in the title is therefore just one of the questions that I've been asked. And in fact, there's a whole lot of other questions that make up the rest of the book. But this question that we're asking tonight, can a scientist believe in miracles, is one of the most important questions that govern the relationship between science and Christianity. And so I think it's an appropriate talk. And an appropriate subject for a discussion like this. And I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So please, as we go through, think of your own questions and ask them later. Well, all right, can a scientist believe in miracles? Well, actually, we can settle this question very quickly. I'm a scientist, I believe in miracles. So therefore, yes, a scientist can believe in miracles. But wait a minute. Maybe not so fast. Maybe I'm lying, or maybe I'm deceiving myself about some of this stuff. So probably you shouldn't just take my word for it. After all, there are lots of people in the world today who think that science is simply impossible if you take seriously such things as miracles, and that miracles are simply impossible if you take seriously modern science. An example is one of my MIT colleagues, Alan Lightman. He's actually a novelist, but he's also trained as a physicist. And a few years ago, he wrote an article that was published in Salon magazine. And in it, he calls, quote, "the central doctrine of science, the view that the laws of nature are inviolable. Quote, science and God are compatible as long as the latter, God, is content to stand on the sidelines once the universe has begun." So in other words, he thinks that it's a requirement for science that the laws of the universe should be closed and impervious to outside action. On this view, what he calls science's central doctrine, which is presumably essential for it to function, rules out God acting in the world. And the only form of God that could survive such a restriction is one that simply happened to have set the universe going, but thereafter is powerless to change it and pretty much irrelevant to anything going on in it. In fact, far more irrelevant than Bill Belichick is on the sidelines of the Patriots game. Champions last year. So whatever such a deistic, non-interventionist first cause might possibly be, it would not be the God of the Bible, of Judaism, or of Christianity. I mean, I'm a Christian. Christians believe that Jesus, the Son of God, died on the cross for our sins and rose again miraculously on the third day. Every Christian worthy of the name, I would say, believes in at least that miracle. Certainly the God that I believe in is active in history and in the world today. So the question really is a fair one to ask: how do I answer Alan Lightman? But the answer is actually rather straightforward. The presumption that the laws of nature are inviolable is just not a doctrine of science. Alan and a lot of other people are simply wrong about that. Science's method and program is to describe the universe insofar as it obeys universal laws. But science doesn't have any need to extrapolate that method and program into a presumption that everything that happens must be so describable. Now, I'm not going to unpack in detail what science is, and I'm talking about natural science, but most people realize that there are certain characteristics and strategies that science adopts for obtaining its knowledge, and that they are the basis of its success. And I identify those strategies as a reliance upon reproducibility, that different people can get the same results if they're careful enough about the experiment at different times. And secondly, upon a descriptive clarity concerning the results of those experiments that scientists can agree upon and understand. But the crucial point is that this approach cannot be applied to every question of interest, to all different types of knowledge. Now, the opposite presumption has taken root through our society very deeply in the last 100 years or so. That is the view that the methods of natural science are the only route to knowledge. And that presumption is called scientism. That its short definition is the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. For example, in 1935, the famous philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote this in his book, Religion and Science, quote, "Whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know." Well, that's pure nonsense if what you mean by science is things like physics and chemistry and biology and geology and cosmology and so forth. And that's what most people do mean by it. And especially it's what they mean by it in our discussion today of the relationship between science and Christianity. But consider history, for example. History contains enormous amounts of true knowledge about the past of great importance. But hardly any of that knowledge is acquired by the methods of science, relying on reproducible experiments and observations. Because most events in human history are unique and unreproducible. They can never be reproduced. And also, hardly any of that knowledge in history is expressible with the kind of scientific clarity that calls for measurement and classification and mathematics and so on. There are examples of people like Russell today who are explicit about their scientism. But usually, scientism is not explicit, is implicit, it's unacknowledged. People don't come out and declare an allegiance to scientism. Often they simply assume it or imply it. So implicit scientism is rife in the writings of the anti-theists of this century. For example, Richard Dawkins writes in his book, The God Delusion, quote, "Did God raise Lazarus from the dead? Did he himself come alive again 3 days after being crucified? There's an answer to every such question, whether or not we can discover it in practice, and it is strictly a scientific answer. The methods we should use to settle the matter would be purely and entirely scientific methods." End quote. Look, the resurrection isn't a scientific claim. It's an historical claim. The methods we should be using to investigate it aren't scientific methods, they're historical methods. Only a belief that science is all the real knowledge there is would lead one to suppose that, quote, "purely and entirely scientific methods are what is required." So probably, I think, the most important way to make progress in understanding the relationship between science and religion is to realize that scientism is a ghastly mistake, and that religious knowledge, like knowledge in many other disciplines, is just as valuable. For example, those other disciplines include things like jurisprudence, or aesthetics, or language, or literature, or philosophy, and so on and so on. So, coming back then to the question of whether the laws of science or the laws of nature are inviolable, the majority of the great scientists of history did not assume that. They did not make that scientific presumption. They didn't think the laws of science are complete and inviolable. How do we know they didn't? Because a large fraction of them were Christian believers. So many of the greatest scientists, like Newton and Boyle and Dalton and Faraday and Maxwell and many others, were Christians. They were believers who saw their science as consistent with a God who is active in the world and on occasion even performs miracles beyond the scientific laws that they were discovering. So the notion that for science to function or to be a successful scientist, it's necessary to believe in inviolable universal laws. It's just not true. It's disproved by history. You needn't take the word of me or any other high-profile scientist of today for it. If scientists couldn't believe in miracles, then the greatest scientists of history weren't scientists, but of course they were. Now, the skeptics' response to what I consider that indisputable argument can either question the scientists' science, those historical scientists' science, or their faith. And the first response is to say, well, scientists of history didn't know the science that we know today. That's true, but I'm going to come back to that point. The second criticism or answer or response is to say, well, probably those people that I just cited were mostly just going along with the customs of the society of their day. Probably Christian belief was just part of their mental baggage, which today we know can be dispensed with. But that second comment is clearly untrue. We know from written evidence that it was untrue for all of the people that I just cited. They took their faith very seriously, they studied it, and in many cases they wrote extensively about it. They weren't just nominal religious believers, they spent enormous efforts to understand and follow their faith. And this imprint is the front page of a book by Robert Boyle of Boyle's Law, and the book is entitled The Christian Virtuoso. In those days, they confused F's and S's in their printing, so it's hard to read. But basically, the book is about the idea that rather than being indisposed by being addicted to experimental philosophy, being indisposed to being a good Christian, in fact, it worked the other way round. That was the point of Boyle's whole book. So it's an example of the fact these people were very serious about their faith. Okay, well, let's not get bogged down, though. I think the more interesting question is not can scientists believe in miracles, but should they believe in miracles? In other words, we should grant that, in fact, scientists have and do and probably will continue to believe in miracles, but we should move to the question, are they right to do so? And here again, I think that the history of science is helpful to us. The history, not so much of the individuals that I've been mentioning, but of ideas. So in the latter part of the 19th century, classical physics was reaching the pinnacle of its achievements. Maxwell's equations had unified light and electricity and magnetism. Even biology was beginning to appear to be amenable to description in terms of laws of nature through Darwin's mechanism of natural selection, in natural terms. And increasingly, to many people, it seemed as though the whole of the universe obeyed deterministic classical equations. And that meant that if you knew what the equations were and you knew the initial conditions, you could solve the equations, and the future was entirely determined. So it was a deterministic view of the world. And a belief in that deterministic philosophy was one of the important factors that was cited by some who rejected Christianity in the 19th century. But since then, the discovery of quantum mechanics and a more thorough understanding of nonlinear physics, and particularly chaos, have essentially overthrown that deterministic viewpoint in physics. We know that the solution of the classical equations actually can't be found because in many cases they have exquisite sensitivity to initial conditions. So you can't actually do that prediction. But even more than that, quantum physics has revealed that there's something intrinsic about the universe that means that it is not deterministic, that you cannot completely predict the future from the laws of nature as we understand them. So one example is the decay of a radioactive nucleus. It's impossible to predict exactly when a nucleus will decay on the basis of the laws of nature because it's governed by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And since we can take a single radioactive decay and use the radiation from it to trigger a switch which can, for example, release poison into a chamber, one can then say that whether or not a cat is killed by poison gas is undetermined in the future. So indeterminacy applies not just to the microscopic atomic level, but it must apply to, in a certain sense, all of nature, at least to some degree. So the situation we then find ourselves is that science has labored mightily over hundreds of years to describe the universe by equations that are deterministic, only to find that in the event we cannot describe the universe entirely by those equations, that there is an uncertainty left behind, and in fact the universe is far more mysterious than the Victorians knew. So a belief in the deterministic philosophy is actually ruled out by the science we know today. So in that sense, it may have seemed a good argument in the 19th century to say that science had shown the universe to be governed by inviolable laws. How could there be such a thing as a miracle? But today, we know better. Actually, what we know of physics today undermines the skeptical position. The argument that the universe is a closed system makes it substantially less plausible, even scientifically today, than it was then. So what we know today of the science that they didn't know in the 19th century has moved us away from that skeptical viewpoint. All right, so suppose that science doesn't actually rule out the theoretical possibility of a miracle. Still, one might ask the question, well, if miracles happen, why aren't there by now loads of scientifically demonstrated miracles that would persuade everyone of their reality? I think that's a good question. Let me start on that question by telling you a personal story. About 35 years ago, my daughter had a playmate who belonged to a Christian family in our street, and we were living in England. This on the left is my daughter Anna when she was at approximately that age. On the right is Anna a couple of years ago with her family, for no good reason other than I love her. So come back to the first picture. Okay. So in the street, this girl fell ill. She had meningitis. She fell into a coma. The prognosis was very bad. The doctor said that even if she did recover consciousness, she would likely have brain damage and be seriously handicapped. So the parents called the elders of their church and asked them to come to the hospital and pray for the girl. They prayed for her recovery in faith in the hospital. And within days, that girl was awake with apparently no ill effects, and within weeks, she was back in the street playing with my daughter. Now, what should we say is the question. Was this or was this not a miracle? Well, how does science work? It works, I've asserted, on the basis of reproducible experiments and observations. If I do an experiment here and now in this particular place, then someone else ought to be able to get the same results somewhere else at some other time. But how do you apply that method to a miracle? You can't. A miracle is inherently, by definition, something unique, never to be reproduced. So you can't apply the principle of reproducibility to the demonstration of a miracle. Consequently, natural science is inherently incompetent to prove something is a miracle. By the way, there are lots of other important aspects of life that don't yield to science, as I just pointed out. History was the example that I gave you. So this is the understanding that leads us to the answer of why the world is not full of scientifically demonstrated miracles, because science is inherently incompetent to demonstrate a miracle. Science can investigate miraculous claims, and it's able to reveal deception or trickery or those kinds of things. And if it does, that can be something that really settles the matter, okay? But if science fails to find defeating evidence like that, then it's really unable to say one way or the other whether some reported event is a miracle. So that's true, actually, of this story. The girl's parents consider that experience as a miraculous healing, as a proof and confirmation of God's love towards them, and of the care of his care, and of the reality and relevance of their faith in Christ. But what would the physicians say was the scientific nature of the event? Well, he or she might say something like, there's no scientific explanation of what happens, but there are lots of things in medicine that we don't understand. All of that's true. He might say that he had or had not ever seen a case like this. But what I suggest he could not, or at least should not say, is that the lack of some scientific explanation of the events proves scientifically that a miracle has occurred. And part of the reason for that is that it takes a matter of interpretation to perceive a miracle. Because a miracle is not just an anomalous event that seems to be contrary to science. Actually, there are lots of anomalous events that seem to be contrary to science happening all the time. In fact, a lot of them happen in laboratories. They're called mistakes. But if you make a mistake in a measurement and it doesn't make sense, and you go back and measure it again and you find a result that makes sense, well, then you don't say a miracle has occurred. You just say, I made a mistake, okay? And so you put it aside and you move on with your science. And you move on with discovering the extent to which the nature and the universe is reproducible. And so that's the way science works. And so the interpretive aspects of this situation, of any extraordinary event, depends on the context and it depends on your presuppositions. And that's one reason, I think, why, in a sense, miracles require faith, as Jesus in the Gospels often emphasized. If you're closed to the possibility of a miracle, then you're never going to be convinced. I mean, don't get me wrong here. When I talked about this event in England, I actually think that was an answer of God to prayer, and in that sense, at least, it was a miracle. But I think there's no way that science can prove that it's a miracle, and it's unreasonable, therefore, to demand such proof. It's worth taking just a moment to think about how the Bible uses the concept of miracle. In fact, what is a miracle, particularly in the New Testament? Now, of course, the word miracle doesn't appear in the New Testament because the New Testament was written in Greek, not in English. But in the New Testament, there are actually three words that are used to refer to the events that we think of as being miracles. And they are signs or wonders or mighty works. And I think that's, for me, helps me to understand how we should think of a miracle. I think the simplest way to summarize the things that these things have in common is to say that in the New Testament sense, a miracle is simply an extraordinary act of God. Now, while we're on the topic of interpretation, I want to say a few words about a distinction that is sometimes made between different types of miracles. On the one hand, you can think about the type of miracle in which it seems as though a law of nature has been broken. On the other hand, you might think about an extraordinary situation which could have been merely a coincidence or an extraordinary confluence of circumstances. So to illustrate what I mean, the law-breaking type of miracle might be turning water into wine. I don't know how that could possibly be consistent with the laws of nature as they normally function. On the other hand, an example of the other confluence of circumstances type of miracle might be Jesus' prediction on the night before his crucifixion that Peter would deny him 3 times before the cock crowed. That just could have been a lucky guess. So it breaks no law of nature. So most people recognize that the confluence of circumstances type of miracle on the right-hand side is a matter of interpretation. It's not something that can be inherently ruled out by the laws of nature. But I hope you've begun to get the feeling, which is what I've been trying to convey, that actually a type of event that seems to be a law-breaking miracle is also not ruled out by the laws of nature, because the laws of nature are what describes the normal working of the world. But miracles are inherently abnormal. They're inherently extraordinary. They aren't constrained by the normal rules. And nevertheless, it's the case that both types of miracle require interpretation to be recognized. And in fact, the difference between them is a very modern difference, and it's very much less clear than you might think. After all, in the first century, no one thought in terms of laws of nature. So it couldn't possibly have been the case that the New Testament would portray miracles as being breaking of laws of nature. That would be nonsense. Okay, but the fact that we require interpretation doesn't mean that we can't be persuaded by events that God is at work. We can. But it does mean that we're never relieved of the necessity of that interpretation. In other words, there's never something so totally self-authenticating that its demonstration cannot be gainsaid by those who are skeptical. Now, I'm going to skip most of this slide in the interest of time. But the point of this quotation from this Nobel Prize-winning biologist, atheist biologist, by the way, is that what he basically says is that science rules out explanation in terms of personality and purpose. And I think he's actually right about that. There are various things that are wrong with this statement, which I won't go into. But he's right to say that science, in a certain sense, its methods, rules out explanation in terms of purpose or intentionality. And so there can't be a scientific description of, for example, the personality of a person, even if we have lots of knowledge about the brain, because that isn't the way that science works. And so it's only a presumption that science explains away the mind, for example, by studying the brain. It's an improper presumption. It's a presumption that's been imported as one of, in a certain sense, the starting methodologies of science. And part of the reason that science rules out purpose is that purpose is intrinsically a higher level concept. It isn't something that you can discover by reducing, by examining the world at smaller and smaller levels. It's something that's inherent to an overall holistic object. So my little finger does not have a purpose. It only has a purpose insofar as I tell it what to do. So if I'm holding it up in order to illustrate something, it is my purpose. It's not the finger's purpose. So purpose is a higher level concept. It applies to agents such as myself. And this has been very much a part of the biblical understanding of the world. Science rules out discussion of purpose by its method, but purpose is obviously part of our experience of the world. It must be treated as a higher level understanding, regardless of whether we have a scientific description of the events at hand. That's true for human purposes, but it's also true for God's and His purposes. Now, a skeptic might take the view that I'm just sort of dangling and sort of trying to escape the fact that somehow science is finding out everything there is to find out about the world. And so Hutchinson is, somehow invoking some higher level concept to try to get out of the fact that science really understands things from the bottom up. But that isn't what's happening here. The Bible has always taken this view of understanding the works of God. It's always taken the view that God can be seen at work even when there are natural explanations of what's happening. And the best example that I know of to illustrate this is the biblical description of the founding event of the Hebrew faith, namely the Exodus. Probably most of you have seen the film of the Ten Commandments, Cecil B. DeMille's marvelous film from the 50s, with Charlton Heston as Moses. The image of that film remains in my mind. Maybe it does in yours. And this is actually a painting of the wonderful image of the Israelites crossing the bed of the Red Sea. And that tends to be the way we think about the Exodus. We tend to think of it in these dramatic sort of special effect types of ways. But that can somehow lead us to not to ignore what the Bible actually says. So what does the Bible actually say? Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. So what the Bible is actually saying is there was a natural explanation for why the Red Sea dried up, namely the strong east wind that was blowing all night. That was, it was a natural, in a crude sense, it was a scientific explanation of the events that the passage refers to. So in other words, different levels of description are at work simultaneously in this biblical passage. And it illustrates that it's always been a characteristic of biblical faith to see God not just in some supposed gaps of our scientific knowledge, but in all the events of the world, whether or not they have, in a certain sense, natural descriptions. It's not just a defensive reaction to the progress of modern science. Well, I can't leave this question of miracles without saying something about superstition. Skeptics sometimes say that in olden times, people didn't understand the workings of the natural world and everything seemed miraculous to them. But that now we do understand so much more that we're better informed, so we can't believe in miracles. But that's really a biased and untrue view, both in terms of its relationship to history and in terms of logic. Concerning history, of course, people in the New Testament times knew far less science than scientists at least know today. But that doesn't mean they knew nothing about the normal course of events and thought that everything was miraculous. They knew perfectly well in the first century that water doesn't suddenly turn into wine, that people blind from birth don't suddenly regain their sight when they're adults, or that people hung on Roman crosses don't suddenly become alive again. In fact, if they hadn't known that, those events wouldn't have functioned for them in the way that they did as the miraculous events they saw them to be. So I would say this: certainly superstitions abounded in history. And perhaps we're less superstitious today, although I'm not completely sure about that. If you think about the way people act in relationship to their sports, for example, there's an enormous amount of superstition surrounds sports. Maybe you didn't see the Bud Light ad for the 2012, but it was all about people making signs and weird motions in order to help their team to win. So maybe we're less skeptical today, but I'm not completely sure about that. I certainly recognize that we humans have a kind of hankering for the special and for the mysterious and so forth. But the truth is that some miracle stories, being implausible superstitions, doesn't disprove all miracles. Miracle stories are not all equal. The evidence for or against their credibility has to be weighed. And it's illogical to rule out miracles simply because they're miraculous, unless you know that there's no such thing as a miracle. But science doesn't provide you with that knowledge. So if you adopt the opinion that miracles just never happen, then I would say you're doing so not as a matter of physics, but as a matter of metaphysics. Or to put it more simply, you're adopting it as an article of faith. Well, I've got a summary of some of the topics that I have covered, and I'm just going to leave that. I'm not going to read through that. I'm just going to leave that up for us. And I just want to close with a few words as follows. in the end, miracles are possible if there's a living God who is in touch with the world. And we Christians say that we have a personal experience of that God through the Holy Spirit, the counselor, who dwells in us, bringing comfort and understanding and conviction and remembrance. And while we don't call that daily experience of God miraculous, because it's not extraordinary, it's ordinary, okay, it's nevertheless an important reason why a Christian, whether or not he's a scientist, can believe in miracles. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ian. We have about 40 minutes left. So this is a time for question and answer. We don't have a microphone. And I'll start us off with a few questions as you're maybe thinking about it. So what we'll ask you to do is just to raise your hand and to ask your question. One of us will repeat that because the microphones for the recording are with us, if that's okay. So that might seem a little bit strange. But Ian's favorite part, he's said several times, is actually the questions that he gets from the people who come. But so as you're thinking about your questions, let me just start us off. I just want to sort of think about, you talked about science and your faith, a man of science and a man of faith. How does science inform your faith? And how does your faith inform your science? So day to day, you research natural phenomena. So
well, I think science informs faith in lots of ways about the natural world. And I mean, one way in which historically over the centuries Christians have thought about that is that they've spoken about God revealing himself through two books: the book of God's Word, the Bible, and the book of God's works, which is nature. And so I certainly take that attitude very seriously, and I do think that we are discovering things about God as we discover things about nature. So that is a very serious way in which science is informing faith, and there are many other more detailed ways that I could talk about. The other side of the question was how does my faith inform my science? Actually, I think there are serious ways in which faith informs science. In fact, in many respects, modern science as we know it was founded on and grew up in a very fertile philosophical and indeed theological environment that came from the Bible itself. And that was part of the reason why science grew up in the West, where Christian thinking held sway, and I think that a good historical case can be made for that. But if I were to speak more personally for myself, I would say this. We think of science and scientists as being people who are great technicians. They know how to do science. They know how to solve equations or do experiments or all those kinds of things. And we do, okay? I mean, yeah, we pat ourselves on the back for that, right? But the truth of the matter is, in my career, in which I've had the privilege of leading, for example, large research groups, there is so much more to being a scientist than just the things you learn in science lectures. And I would say that many of the things that have made me successful in my scientific career, or have been very important for the success of my scientific career, are things like how to deal respectfully with people, personal interactions, organizing teamwork, et cetera, et cetera. And those are the things I would say I learned more than anything else through my Christian faith.
Thank you. Over to you. Who's going to start us off with any questions? It's right at the back there, yeah.
Yeah, speak up loudly.
So, if we sequester, it seems like you want to sequester science and like higher order functions, different domains, and spread them out that way. And if that's true, can we ever say that it's irrational to not believe in miracles?
I wouldn't say it's irrational to disbelieve miracles. I don't think the process that I'm going through is an attempt to sequester. I would say we have to recognize that there are different ways in which we gain knowledge. There are different types of knowledge that we have. And if you try to reduce all knowledge and treat all knowledge that's worth having as if it's scientific, then you will basically lose track of everything that makes us into more than simply flesh and blood. And I think all of those things are valid knowledge, the things that I talked about, history, the arts, aesthetics, literature, language, and so forth. So I just think it's common sense to recognize that there are things that go beyond the things that we normally treat as being part of science. So I don't think it's irrational to disbelieve in miracles. I think it simply leaves the question open. Science is not in a position to prove it one way or the other. And so one has to approach this in a different way. And I think most people approach the question of miracles on the basis of their own experience and the testimony they hear from others. And these are things which are not part, in general, of the scientific enterprise. Thank you.
If we assume that we almost never know enough to if we assume that we almost never know enough to explain an event in every detail, so we open our door to the fact that, okay, I don't know it today, but maybe I will know that tomorrow. So in this case, every miracle is an event which you just cannot explain today. How then it can be the works of deity, and why should we attribute something we cannot explain to the higher powers?
Well, okay, thank you for that question. Did everyone get that? Basically, I would question the premise. And that is that I tried to say that a miracle isn't just something we don't know how to explain. Actually, a miracle is, in a certain sense, a situation which we are invoking a different type of explanation that may be simultaneously true with explanations that might come from science. And that's my example of the Exodus. I mean, the Bible says there was an explanation for why the waters were parted, and it was the persistent east wind. And yet, there was something so special about the circumstances surrounding that event that the Hebrews interpreted that as an act of God. And I think the same is true of many types of miracles today. They aren't necessarily things that are completely impossible or have no scientific explanation, but there are things which the circumstances are so extraordinary that we interpret them as an act of God. But I think maybe what you're perhaps getting at is that we regard miracles, or certainly Christianity generally regards certain types of miracles as having some kind of evidentiary value. And I think that they do, and I think that the New Testament does, for example, point to the resurrection as evidence for the deity of Christ and for the truth of his claims, for example. But I think that all of those kinds of evidences are the kinds of evidences that happen at the conceptual level, not at the level of measurement or mathematics or the kinds of things that we require, the clarity that we require of the natural sciences. So I think that's more or less the answer I would give to your question. But thank you for that question.
So my question regards more of along the lines of like the purpose for being a scientist, right? So some people will say, oh, I'm a scientist because I want to find out more about the world, or like I want to be able to describe the world in those deterministic terms. So why are you a scientist based off being a Christian, right?
Okay. I think that historically, people who pursued natural philosophy, as it was then called at the beginning of the scientific revolution, weren't particularly governed by that deterministic outlook or any kind of specific outlook. They just wanted to know what was true. And they found that the approach of relying on reproducibility and being very careful about clarity was an extremely powerful way of finding out the way that the world normally works. So I guess you asked me the question, why am I mean, it's sort of a question, why am I a scientist? What draws me to a scientist? Actually, I got into science because when I was setting out in middle school, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, and I was studying the classics, Greek and history and stuff like that, Latin. But that was before I started to take physics. And my first class in physics had an outstanding physics teacher, and he was just lots of fun, and it was finding out about the world. And this was wonderful, and I was good at it. And I thought, wow, I was completely wrong. Golly, what made me think I wanted to be a lawyer in the first place? Well, I must have been crazy, okay? And so that's the reason why I mean, that's just a straight answer to why I was drawn into science. I think that having grown up, I became a Christian when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge University. And so there's a sense in which my science at the university level and my Christianity grew together. And I would say they've both been, in a certain sense, vocations for me. In fact, I see them in a certain sense as part of the same vocation. But it would probably take too long to unpack that. Sorry, that's about the answer I can give you, but thank you. Yeah.
You talk about types of questions that science is just inherently incompetent to address. And I have long felt that one of the biggest examples of that is the whole idea of human consciousness, which, if the universe is just matter and energy and time, where does self-awareness come from? Do you know of any reputable non-theistic thinkers who have actually attempted to answer that question?
Well, I'll address the question. I'm not sure I can answer do I know of any thinkers? I can't answer that part of the question. I would say this. Clearly, something like consciousness is incredibly complex. Is it more than just wetware? Neurons firing and enzymes activating and so on and so forth. It seems to me perfectly obvious that consciousness, that thinking, that thoughts must be more than that. In fact, there's a logical problem if you don't believe that it's more than that, because if what I'm saying today and what I'm thinking at this moment is not more than just wetware, why would you listen to what I'm saying? I mean, the very idea that there is nothing to our ideas is a contradiction in terms. So you have to take the view, it seems to me, logically, that somehow conscious thought goes beyond simply the implementation of it in whatever biological mechanisms go on in the brain, which is where most of our thinking takes place. But I don't actually think that leads you immediately into a theistic explanation. So I wouldn't put that forward as a strong, as a knockdown argument, let's say, for there must be a God or we must have souls or those kinds of things. I think there are ways of understanding the world at different levels, and I think scientists are actually familiar with that. But I don't think that that amounts to a proof of the reality of the spiritual. So I would say that I think it's very important to think about those things. We sometimes get nervous, I think Christians or even non-Christians get nervous about the idea that we'll one day have a scientific explanation of how the brain works. I don't actually feel at all nervous about that, because I don't think once we have an explanation of how the brain works, it will remove from us the significance of our mental lives. They will remain just the way they are today. Hello.
Is it possible to find scientific explanations for miracles from the past?
Is it possible to find scientific explanations for miracles from the past? I think there may be events in the past that today we can offer possible scientific explanations for. That we might say that, for example, a healing from the past, we might say we would explain that today in terms of certain aspects to do with medical science. But that doesn't get to the heart of the question, which is, was God part of that? In other words, I would go back to my definition of a miracle as being an extraordinary act of God. If an extraordinary event proves to have a scientific explanation, that actually doesn't answer the question, was it an act of God or not? And that is a matter of interpretation. And so I think my quick answer to your question is fundamentally no, we won't explain miracles of the past by science today, but it can lead us to a different way of interpreting them. Thank you for that question. Yes?
You mentioned that faith is something that kind of came into the picture during your undergraduate career. Can you talk a little bit more about your faith background growing up and then why it became important then?
I grew up in a family which was not religious. We didn't go to church except possibly for weddings. I went to a school which had a sort of nominal relationship to Christianity. There were prayers said in assemblies and so forth, which I realize is sort of unusual by American standards, is not unusual by British standards. So I wasn't completely ignorant of Christianity, but I didn't believe it. It wasn't something that I took any interest in, or I just thought it was just not for me. And I didn't take it seriously until I went to Cambridge University, and the reason I began to take it seriously was because I had two good college student friends, both of whom turned out to be Christians, and whose intellect and personalities I found attractive. I mean, there were smart guys like me. I don't know. Sorry about that. But that's the way I felt about it. Okay. I mean, and so that's how I began to take Christianity seriously. And in the second year at Cambridge, my friends invited me to go to a series of lectures given by a man called Michael Green, who was a well-known Christian speaker in those days, and basically all about fundamentals of Christianity. And there were two things that struck me as ideas that I'd never really thought about before. Again, I was not totally ignorant of Christianity. There were services round about me. But the two ideas that struck me as sort of completely new, as if I never heard them before, were, first of all, that there's good evidence for the claims of Christianity. That's something I believe is true to this day. I believe it. In particular, I think there's good evidence that the resurrection of Jesus took place, and there isn't a good alternative explanation for what happened to the early disciples who went out and changed the world, taking with them the message that Jesus had risen from the dead. That was one. The second concept that came as a new idea to me was that actually Christianity wasn't just sort of a theological concept, but it was actually a personal relationship with the Creator through Jesus Christ. And those two things eventually led me to the position where I realized I kind of did believe it. And it was later on that year in my room that I knelt and committed my life to Christ, and I've been a follower of Jesus Christ ever since. So that's how I became a Christian. Yes?
You know, one point I really liked was, which I can summarize by simply saying today, people understand the foundations of quantum mechanics as being essentially the foundations of reality is basically probabilistic. And in that sense, it's actually built out of a relationship. If we look for a particle, we're going to see a particle. If we look for a wave, we're going to see a wave. So it's really sort of like information. It's a relationship between reality and us.
Yeah, did everyone hear that comment? I won't repeat it. He basically said, yeah, quantum mechanics teaches us that we find what we look for in a certain sense. And there is some truth, there's deep truth in that. It's subtle, but it's truthful. Yeah. Okay.
Early on, you were able to share briefly how your faith colors and motivates the scientific work you do. How does the answer to this question, can a scientist believe in miracles, change the formal aspects of how science is done, the business aspect?
Sorry, the last bit I didn't quite catch.
How does our answer to this question, can a scientist believe in miracles, change the formal aspects of the scientific work that's done globally today?
I don't think it does change it hardly at all, actually, because when we're doing science, we're studying the normal behavior, the ordinary course of events, and that's what we're in the business of trying to understand. And we, as scientists and engineers, recognize that that's very important to know, and it leads us to technologies, and it leads us to deep understanding of the world. And so the fact that there might be events which go beyond that understanding of the normal course doesn't really change the fact that we're pursuing our science. In particular, I would say, faith is not a science stopper. The belief in miracles is not a science stopper. It doesn't prevent you from doing good science if you believe in miracles. Thank you. Yeah, there's a question here.
So my understanding is that there's a lot of debate on the interpretation of quantum mechanics. Famously, I think Einstein and Bohr debated this, Einstein taking the position that there must be some hidden variables we don't have access to, Bohr taking the position that the probability fields were reality. I'm interested in your interpretation of it and why.
Yes, thank you for raising that. It's true, and in particular, quantum mechanics is so shocking, and was so shocking to Albert Einstein himself, that he couldn't bring himself to accept that the uncertainties that seem to be present in quantum mechanics are true uncertainties. He felt there had to be some deterministic way of understanding the world behind it. You know, that's a sign of how shocking a change it was when quantum mechanics came to be. Because after all, Albert Einstein was someone who had shown immense flexibility in the way that he understood the world. I mean, he's the guy who came up with relativity, for heaven's sake. So he wasn't kind of hidebound in the way that he approached things. And yet it was so shocking for him. Since that time, experiments and theory development have shown, have persuaded most physicists that in fact there aren't hidden variables. That even though people can offer possible ways of interpreting quantum mechanics, none of them actually work systematically. And in fact, for example, Bell's theorems show that you can pretty much demonstrate that there can't be hidden variables behind quantum mechanics, that really it's fundamental to the universe. Now, sometimes people will say, but the equations of quantum mechanics are in fact deterministic. That is correct. The equations of quantum mechanics are deterministic equations. They're differential equations that you can solve. But those equations don't describe the outcomes of results. They only describe the probabilities of outcomes of results. And it's that underlying fact that in the end, we don't end up with a description of the world. We end up with a probabilistic description, not a deterministic description. Thank you for that question. Are we allowing this one? Yes, please.
A simple question. Is there such a thing as pseudoscience?
Is there such a thing as pseudoscience? What most people mean by pseudoscience is something that is pretending to be scientific, but isn't really rigorous and doesn't really follow the normal approaches that science adopts. Actually, it's very hard to detect pseudoscience because the way science proceeds is largely as a community kind of activity. So something becomes established in science not by someone making particular claims, but by them persuading a community of scientists that their ideas are true to the world. And that can take place because science allows us to do reproducible experiments or to make reproducible observations so that we can all persuade ourselves as a community that that this is true. So the answer is yes, there is such a thing as pseudoscience, and it's usually the sorts of claims that are put forward for other motivations than pure knowledge, very often commercial motivations, but sometimes other types of motivations, fame and etc., fortune, blah blah blah. Let me also comment that in that respect, that this community aspect of science is one of the ways in which science is not so terribly different from Christianity or from the religious enterprise. I mean, it's actually the case that long before there were scientific communities, there were religious communities. And those religious communities tested and have, through the centuries, tested the ideas that their theologians and their mystics and their, people who live in hermitages and so on and so forth come up with. And so actually this idea of there being communities of knowing and communities of organization is very important to the way we as humans know things. Thank you for raising that question. There's one at the back next. I think we're going to oscillate from the front to back. Yes?
I just had a question about kind of like how we can actually determine if miracles are happening. You kind of said that like we often use like historical evidence. I was wondering if we could also use like statistical kind of analysis to understand it. Oftentimes miracles occur because we pray or have petitions to God for a miracle to occur. I think many of the examples you've given have that. Do you think we could use statistics to kind of show that miracles happen or are the result of petitions to God?
Thank you. So this is a question about can we discover miracles statistically? There have been some efforts to, try to prove or disprove the efficacy, for example, of prayer through statistical techniques. I think there's an inherent problem with that, and that is that, basically God doesn't yield himself to those kinds of tests. And the way it's sometimes put is that you shall not put the Lord your God to the test, okay? But the answer of most of those statistical studies, these sort of double-blind statistical studies of people praying for people they didn't know or they did know or something like that, there are all kinds of ways that these psychological experiments have been set up. Is they certainly haven't come up with clear proofs that that petitionary prayer in that situation works, okay? So it isn't magic, is what that proves, okay? There's a difference between magic, by the way, and prayer. I would say the answer is that statistically, trying to demonstrate that an event is a miracle is extremely difficult because an event is a single event, okay? And if a miracle is an extraordinary, unique event, okay, then I don't see how you apply statistics to it. That's why I sort of changed the question into a question about prayer, because there is a sense in which prayer is not necessarily a matter of miracles, all of it, because it's something that people do routinely, okay? And in that routine sense, I think there isn't a routine scientific proof, for example, of the existence of God that you can come up with by showing that, for example, petitionary prayer works. Okay?
Scientific people of faith like yourself, I'm assuming that's a relatively small fraternity.
Why?
Well, this is my question. Is it a small fraternity, not gender-based, of course, fraternity or sorority? Do you get a lot of pushback from people that obviously don't share your point of view in some of the material that you put forward?
Well, okay, thank you. I think everyone heard that question, are there few scientists of faith, and if so, do I get pushback, okay? First, the answer is no. If you do surveys of professors in the academy, in higher education, let's say in America, and you ask, first of all, those professors in the academy generally tend less often to be believers than the general public. So it's a smaller fraction overall of university professors are believers than in the general public. But if you break that down by discipline, and you ask, well, how many scientists, are believers, or what fraction of the humanities people are believers, or social studies are believers, it turns out the scientists are on the high end of the fraction. And engineers are even higher. They're clearly the highest proportion. So the idea which you've put forward, which is not, I don't mean to attack you over this, because everyone tends to believe this, okay? The lowest end tends to be the sociologists, okay? But I think it's a very important question, because people have in their mind, the idea that it's impossible to be a scientist and be religious, but it's got nothing to do with science. And the evidence is, in fact, the opposite way round, that within higher education, if anything, scientists tend to be more often Christians than people in the humanities and social studies. You wanted to make a comment about sociologists? Are you a sociologist?
Worse, I'm a lawyer.
Oh, okay. You wanted to defend yourself. Okay, we accept the defense.
A related question. I'm one who, at a young age, thought I was going to be a scientist, and then went to college and ended up being a lawyer.
So you saw the dark.
I saw the dark side. So here's the question. In matters of faith, what did your study of the classics, and it was ultimately going to lead you to law, what was lacking that was enhanced by your study of science?
In my own personal case, I think what was lacking was an ability in languages, okay? And I'm much better at science than I am at languages. But I mean, I would say that in a strange way, that early experience has been fruitful for me as a Christian. I mean, the fact that I learned Greek, as a teenager, is actually a little bit helpful, because I can read the New Testament in Greek if push comes to shove, So I think that it was helpful to me. But bottom line was, I was just much better at science, and I just found it more fun. Yeah.
I'm sorry if this is still a pretty basic question, but I'm still confused about what would you call it are like the objective criteria of calling some event as a miracle? Because even if someone really grants it that miracles can happen, not only can happen, but do happen, but that does not mean that one has some sort of epistemological warrant to believe that that event is a miracle. So is there any objective criteria of calling something a miracle? And the second part would be, is there any event that is claimed to be a miracle, but you don't believe it to be a miracle?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And
So
why?
let me answer the second question first. There are lots of miracle claims that happen all the time, okay? And I think it's perfectly reasonable to be skeptical about a lot of them. So when I hear about people reporting, statues of Mary that are weeping and so on and so forth, I'm immediately very skeptical, okay? Not just because I'm not a Roman Catholic, okay? I mean, I just think that that's would be kind of tacky, okay? Maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, that's the way I feel. I'm just telling you how I feel. The other thing to point out is that even the Roman Catholic Church is highly skeptical about miracle claims. The shrine at Lourdes keeps track of the miracle claims that have been made concerning healings at that shrine. And in the past 100 years, only about 1% of those claims have actually been endorsed by the Roman Catholic Church as being miraculous. I don't actually think that the Roman Catholic Church is in a position to give its stamp of approval one way or the other. I think coming back to the first part of your question, which was, are there objective criteria, or what is the epistemological status of miracle claims? I don't think there is some kind of objective formula that you can say, this is how you establish whether something is a miracle or not, because I tried to say that I think that it's a matter in large measure of interpretation. And Jesus was very familiar with that. I mean, all the things Jesus did, the Pharisees and the Jews of the day, despite the remarkable things he did, they were perfectly happy setting those aside and saying, no, this man is not from God, okay? So even in the Bible itself, you see this tension, this fact that there's an interpretation, and those who are going to believe, believe, and those who aren't going to believe, don't believe. And you can't solve everything by that. But I do think you can approach the history of Christ himself and what we read about in scriptures and the Christian faith as a whole, and try to make a kind of assessment. It's not an objective assessment, perhaps, but it's an assessment of how plausible the claims of Christianity are. And I think it was the plausibility of that came across to me as I was telling this woman earlier. This became persuasive to me, and I still stand by the fact that I find Christianity a very persuasive story, and the Gospels very persuasive documents. So thank you for that question. I think there's a question over there. There's a certain irony in passing this microphone, which doesn't do anything, right?
Hi, Dr. Hutchinson. Thank you so much for coming in and speaking with us about your experience as a Christian Scientist. So I just had two more personal questions for you. The first is, when was a time where you were most proud of being a Christian Scientist? And when was the time that you were most discouraged with being a Christian Scientist?
Golly. There have been lots of times when I've thought I've been greatly encouraged by the acts of people, fellow Christians, who have shown great compassion and great steadfastness in the face of suffering or in the face of other people's suffering. And that certainly warms my heart and makes me feel proud of the long tradition of Christianity as leading people to act sacrificially and compassionately towards others. When am I ashamed to be a Christian? I haven't been there, but I think I would be ashamed if I went to Kentucky to the Creation Museum, because I think that's a travesty of Christian scholarship. I think when Christians take this kind of narrow literalistic view of interpreting the Bible and think that overthrows all of science, I think they've lost track of what I tried to say earlier, that the historic Christian view is that God has revealed himself both through nature and through the Bible, and we shouldn't pit those two things against one another. And when Christians who want to act faithfully, I don't doubt, do so in a way which brings the Christian faith into disrepute because it is naive and untrue to what we know about the world, that makes me uncomfortable, makes me ashamed, if you like. Yes?
Speaking of that, you have said that you're an old earther. How do you reconcile that with the first few chapters of Genesis?
How long have you got? Well, look, you know, I don't know whether you came to the last Veritas forum that was held here in Illinois, but it was John Walton, who is an Old Testament scholar, who was explaining the first few chapters of Genesis, as I understand it. I wasn't at the forum, but I know his work very well, and he's a good friend. I'm pretty comfortable with the way he approaches it. Here's what I would say. If we think about the Bible is full of all kinds of different literature. So it has poetry, it has history, it has religious liturgy, it has proverbs, it has prophecy, it has letters, it has biography. The one type of literature it does not have, I will say with 100% certainty, is scientific literature. There is no scientific literature in the Bible because there was no science when the Bible was written, so there couldn't possibly be. So on its face, that means to me that it's kind of silly to go to the Bible and expect the Bible to offer to me scientific descriptions of the world that I would recognize fit with modern science. And so I think forcing the Bible to try to do that is a mistake. Personally, when I read first chapter of Genesis, it seems completely obvious to me that this is not science, number one, and it's not even history. It's actually more like liturgy. It's a celebration of the fact that God has created everything. And I believe that the main message of Genesis 1 is not how did God create the earth, but that he created it. Because after all, when you think about the environment of the early Hebrews, they were surrounded by all kinds of tribal deities. The message of Genesis 1 is that God, if he's truly God, is not like the tribal deities of the people around you who fights for his own tribe. He made the whole thing. This was a new idea in those days. It's the whole foundation of monotheism. And that, to me, is what Genesis 1 is about. I take a very high view of the Bible, but I don't take the view that the Bible can be approached in a naive, literalistic way, in a way that is productive, because no literature can ever be interpreted literalistically and have its meaning preserved, whether it's the Bible or anything else. The Bible, like every other literature, is full of metaphor and expression of difficult concepts in creative ways. And our Lord was the master of that. When he said, "I am the true vine," did he mean that he was a creeping plant with a brown stem and green leaf? No, of course not. So we don't interpret that literally. Well, okay, it's okay to interpret the Bible in ways that are metaphorical rather than literal. Yeah.
Don't you believe that the God who created the universe and everything in it could have the Bible written, his holy word, written exactly the way he wanted it?
I think he did. But I don't think that necessarily I or anyone else knows exactly what he wanted. So I believe the Bible is the inspired word of God, that all Scripture is profitable for teaching, reproof, and correction, and for the equipping of the saints of God. But I think when we come to any literature, we bring our own ideas, and we cannot escape the fact that we have a job of interpretation. And when we, the Christian church, interpret the Bible, we need to have a certain level of humility about it and not stake all of our entire existence on a particular interpretation of the Bible. I don't think that by doing so, by recognizing the importance of interpretation, that we put ourselves on a slippery slope to discounting, everything in the Bible. I don't think that's a fear which I think is overblown in some quarters of our Christian faith, and I want to get away from that. But let's be constructive. I do think that the Scriptures are a vital part of our Christian faith. I've learned an enormous amount from reading the Bible that has helped me in my own life and sometimes even in my science. And I owe a great deal to that. And I don't want to wouldn't for a moment wish to undermine it.